unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. If you're like me, you've probably read 1,001 post-mortem analyses of the India-Pakistan conflict seeking to draw out some new nugget or data point that helps you understand this brief but intense clash between these two rivals. In this sea of hot takes, one essay struck me both for its analytical clarity as well as its wisdom. That piece was written by the scholar Joshua White, and it's simply titled Lessons for the Next India-Pakistan War. It was published by the Brookings Institution, where Josh is a non-resident fellow. Josh also has a day job. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C. Like our guest on last week's show, Chris Clary, Josh also has extensive experience inside the U.S. government. He served at the White House as senior advisor and director for South Asian affairs at the National Security Council. He's also worked at the Pentagon, where he helped get the U.S.-India Defense Technology and Trade Initiative off the ground. To talk more about his piece and the recent conflict, I'm pleased to welcome Josh back to the program. Josh, thanks so much for taking the time.
Great being with you.
So we are recording this episode about 10 days or so after India and Pakistan agreed to lay down their arms in what Indian officials have termed an agreement, not a ceasefire. In your piece, you write that, look, there's a lot we still don't know thanks to the so-called fog of war. But it's pretty clear, at least in your view, that this was the most dangerous India-Pakistan crisis in at least a quarter century. And I think maybe that's a good place to start. You know, we've seen a series of, we've seen a pattern of events over the past couple of decades where there is an attack on Indian soil, typically attributed to Pakistani-based terrorist groups. In recent years, we've seen a kinetic or a military response from the Indian side, often a retaliatory strike by the Pakistanis. How do you put this most recent conflict in that comparative context?
Well, I love Grand Tamasha listeners because they're very well informed. So I don't have to go through a list of dates and crises one by one. But I do think there's an interesting big story here that we can orient ourselves into. The UPA government, as we all know, showed considerable restraint in the face of terrorism, even after the Mumbai attacks in 2008. And they had some good reasons for doing so. There were some reasons that made sense and were compelling at the time. But Modi and his team came in with a belief that inaction in the face of terrorism was just intolerable. Not just because they saw themselves as tougher than the last guys, but because they had seen the persistence of terrorist attacks. And they'd seen it at a time when India was doing its best to ignore Pakistan and focus on other things. They wanted to act, but I think they faced a problem. And the problem was that the space available for undertaking a conventional ground force campaign, think tanks and infantry and the like, had seemed to close. And that's because Pakistan had developed tactical nuclear weapons that were designed to shut that kind of campaign down, to make it infeasible, and to make it just too risky for an Indian prime minister to attempt even a shallow ground incursion out in the desert. So as a consequence, India, since 2016 and the Uri crisis, has found increasingly creative and risky military responses to avoid big army movements. But these are responses designed to try to punish Pakistan, degrade terrorist groups, and show resolve to the Indian people. And even if you argue that they really only accomplished the third of those objectives, we have seen a stepwise increase in complexity and risk-taking. And so all this to say, what we saw recently with Pahalgam is in some ways an old story. It's terrorist attacks in India prompting a retaliation against Pakistan. But in some ways, it's a new story because India is probing new Pakistani weaknesses. It's taking new kinds of risks, and it's setting a higher bar in each crisis for how it is going to respond to the next.
So, okay, that was brilliant. That sets us up, I think, really well for your four big takeaways. And I think it's worth going through them one by one. And let me start with the question or the issue of attribution. I just want to quote something that you wrote in your piece. You write, "The global debate on quote-unquote attribution has tilted decisively in India's favor, but in ways that may exacerbate political pressures to react hastily following future terrorist attacks, right? So we know that India has neither apprehended the terrorists who killed 26 innocent people on April 22nd, nor has it produced, at least for the public domain, any evidence of Pakistan's direct involvement. You note, and I totally agree with you, neither of those facts have really received much attention. Why do you think that's the case?
After any crisis, you want to ask yourself, what happened? What do we know? What do we don't know? But it's also worth asking what didn't happen. And in this case, I was struck at how little attention was paid, particularly here in the United States, but also by India's European partners, to who exactly did this. And I think there's a lesson in this absence. India has largely persuaded many of its key partners to do what India itself started to do at least a decade ago, which is just assume Pakistan is guilty. Now, you may say, hold on, facts matter. And I'm a professor, so I believe very much that facts matter. But let's understand the Indian argument here, which has been increasingly adopted by Washington. I think there are three parts to it. First, there's the deep history. You can look back to the partition in 1947, the first war over Kashmir that took place in 47, 48. Pakistan has a long history of using militant and terrorist groups to target India. There are shelves worth of credible academic books on this topic, and the U.S. government has presumably amassed extensive evidence of this that's available to U.S. policymakers. Second, Pakistan has not clearly stopped supporting terrorist groups, or at the very least, it seems to let them operate on its soil. They reined in some of these groups under pressure from the Financial Action Task Force in recent years, but many of the high-profile facilities and leaders are still pretty obviously there. And then third, there's a considerable history of Pakistan using fact-finding efforts to delay or deflect accountability. So the evidence uncovered by the U.S. and India after the Mumbai attacks in 2008 didn't prompt Pakistan to shut down Lashkar-e-Taiba. And more recently, I remember this because I was at the White House at the time, India invited a Pakistani investigation team to come to India after the Pathankot attacks in 2016, which targeted an Indian Air Force base. The Pakistani team ended up visiting and then returned home and claimed that India had, quote, stage managed the attack. That did not go over well. So you can look at these three arguments and maintain that we should do careful attribution of terrorist attacks. But the disinclination to do so, I think, is a problem of Pakistan's own making. Right? It's a predictable consequence of the Pakistani leadership choosing to permit or facilitate Islamic militancy rather than shut it down. And when you combine these Indian arguments with the growing interest that the United States and the Europeans have in deepening economic and strategic ties with India, you can see how the attribution question has really begun to fall away.
But Josh, there is an interesting point you make in your piece where there is a downside or potential downside consequence of this, right? So on the one hand, by neutralizing the attribution question, Indian leaders, as you write, they've curbed Pakistan's ability to delay, to deny, to internationalize the crisis. But at the same time, they also may have made it more difficult to kind of contain, very nationalistic, jingoistic media calls for kind of retaliation for, those voices who are baying for blood. And so there is a domestic consequence in this case for India, isn't there?
There is. Imagine that tomorrow there's another gruesome attack in India that kills 20 or 30 or 40 innocent civilians. And imagine it's an attack that looks similar to previous attacks that were linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed. Many Indians will say, we don't need to spend time figuring out who exactly did this. After the Prime Minister's recent speech, many will say, Modi ji said Pakistan's encouraging terrorism. Modi ji said we shouldn't distinguish between terrorists and the governments that sponsor them. So the only question then is how and how quickly we hit back. That kind of public reaction doesn't mean that the Indian government has no choices anymore. It doesn't mean that it has to act immediately on the advice of whomever is shouting the loudest in one of those little boxes that show up on Indian news shows, where you have 6 or 8 or 10 commentators. But it does mean that the government faces more pressure to act, and it faces more pressure to do so quickly. Scholars have kind of a boring word for this, which is audience costs. They say this imposes audience costs, but it's not a boring concept. I mean, the prime minister has set expectations that will make Indians question, I think, any future attempt to conduct investigation, or will make it more difficult to roll out diplomatic or economic or other kinds of responses that aren't as flashy as military responses. So this dynamic could increase pressure on the government and could have the result of speeding up the next crisis, or of ironically making it difficult for the government to find other creative responses to terrorism.
So I want to kind of pause here for a second and do a little bit of shameless promotion for your new book, which is coming out, I believe, in the fall. It's a book called Vigilante Islamists, and it's actually quite pertinent to this conversation because the book looks at the role that Pakistani-based Islamist political parties have played, both as collaborators as well as competitors with violent, militant anti-state movements, right? So we want to have you back to talk about your book when it comes out, but give us a little sneak preview. What is the nature of the connection between these violent movements and the state? And, what were you able to uncover through your own explorations?
Thanks for the plug. This is a book that's been 20 years in the making, so I'm delighted that it's coming out from Oxford University Press. The book was born out of my time living in Peshawar and hanging out with Islamist parties and a variety of pro-Taliban activists and politicians and former Mujahideen types who were confronting something kind of new and kind of scary, which was the rise of violent Islamist groups that were targeting the Pakistani state. So I was there in the early days as the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, were congealing together in the tribal areas. And many politicians and clerics were caught between the ideological allure of these groups and, on the other hand, their interest in participating in Pakistani democracy and the patronage and status that brings. So the book looks at 30 years of violent religious challenges to the Pakistani state, from the early movements in Swat in the early 90s to the TTP, to Barelvi extremism, and how Islamist parties and other groups have dealt with that. So I go very deep on some of the ideological debates, which are found in obscure Urdu magazines, about whether you can attack a state led by Muslims, or questions of vigilantism, which I think are quite interesting. But ultimately, I conclude that you have to look at the vulnerabilities of Islamist parties and other organizations to really understand how they operate. So many of them have deep dependencies on the military and intelligence services that shape how they respond then to the militant fringe Islamist groups, think groups like TTP and ISIS, that are assaulting the Pakistani state, both physically and ideologically. And so the book is a story about religiously justified violence. It's a story about the vulnerabilities that many Islamist groups have to the state. And in that sense, I think it's relevant to the conversation we're having about this particular crisis, because it sheds light on some of the inner dynamics of the relationships that a variety of Islamist organizations have built with the Pakistani state in a way that at times serves the interests of both the state and these organizations.
I mean, I just want to kind of wrap this up a little bit in a bow to just like link it back to the previous conversation. I mean, what I've taken away from what you've said, and you allude to this in the piece, is we know that the Pakistani military has allowed a spate of militant and terrorist groups to operate largely unobstructed within the sovereign territory of Pakistan. And on the one hand, the patterns of state cooperation with these groups are very visible. I mean, in this recent crisis, there was a slain terrorist leader whose I think funeral it was attended by kind of who's of kind of Pakistani military leaders. But the details of any single operational partnership are really, really opaque and obscure, right? So that gives you this kind of gray zone of plausible deniability.
That's what makes this hard. The patterns, the broad patterns of cooperation of the military's attempts to instrumentalize militant and terrorist groups over the long arc of Pakistani history, that's quite clear. But the details of any particular attack and whether this attack was able to happen because of operational space provided in Pakistan or because of an actual directive, those things are very difficult to suss out. And that's why I think the Indian government has grown increasingly frustrated at efforts related to attribution and investigation because they focus attention on particulars, which are hard to discover, and they often ignore the broader arc of what we know to be the strategic impulses of the Pakistani state.
So let's come to the second big takeaway that you have from this conflict, and it's about target selection. You write that the two militaries, India and Pakistan, have set troubling new precedents about target selection that will influence military planning and could raise the stakes for a future war. How would you describe the targeting precedents from this conflict, and what do you think they're going to mean for the next time there's a clash between these two militaries?
Recognizing that there's still a lot about this conflict we haven't unpacked yet, I think each side has a few things to worry about with respect to the kind of targets that were used in this conflict. For India, one worry should be that they used up their quote-unquote best targets this time. India struck the Lashkar-e-Taiba headquarters in Marike. They struck the Jaish-e-Mohammed complex at Bahawalpur. Both of these and some of the other targets that they struck had presumably been on their lists for years, if not at the top of their lists. So next time there's an attack in India, the Indian military planners in consultation with civilian leaders will have to go further down their list and probably deeper physically into Pakistan to find sites that tell as compelling a story as these sites do. This also means, I think, that they'll face pressure to begin with, or perhaps move quickly to, other targets, such as Pakistani military or intelligence facilities. Or they might pair counter-terrorist strikes with special operations actions or naval activities. The idea is that if you're in an environment where the next response has to be better than the last response, you face pressure to add more complexity to your targeting and to choose deeper targets. And each of these new iterations would be risky in its own way, right? These are plausible but risky responses. For Pakistan, I think the principal worry should be that India was able to strike so deep into its territory. Bahawalpur is over 100 kilometers from the India-Pakistan border. India struck an airbase in Rawalpindi near the military headquarters. And it wasn't just the depth of the strikes, it was the nature of the military targets themselves. Indian military briefers have said in recent days publicly that they targeted command and control centers and air defense systems. Both of these are compelling military targets, right? And Pakistan has to be concerned about why India was able to reach those targets and why their own air defense systems didn't seem to work so well as they moved deeper into the country. But there's something else here. Targeting command and control systems and air defense systems is inherently quite risky because your adversary begins to worry that you're trying to blind them in advance of doing something bigger or more dramatic. And I'll tell you, Millen, I started to get really nervous in this crisis when I saw both sides volleying drones and missiles against each other's air defenses, because this targeting pattern can cause militaries to act more impulsively, and it could really increase the risks of a major shooting war or even consideration of nuclear use by Pakistan because of the anxiety that's induced that you might be blinded, that you might not see a big thing coming. It changes the response dynamics in quite unpredictable ways.
So this is actually kind of a nice segue to the third lesson, which is about information warfare and information operations, right? And one of your initial conclusions from this conflict is that information operations appear to be moving from the periphery to the center stage of wartime planning, particularly within the kind of Pakistani, defense military establishment. And what I really liked about this section is that you sort of reflected on your own thinking about this. And I just want to read what you wrote. You said, over the last decade, I found Pakistani defense journals to be replete with articles about information warfare. I had largely dismissed this writing as trendy groupthink, or perhaps as an attempt to mimic the more subtle Chinese writings about informationized warfare. But I may have been wrong. Tell us a little bit about how and why you're questioning your priors on this.
So I have been reading these journals for a while. I even spent a wonderful...
As one does, right? Just for leisurely Sunday reading.
I even spent a wonderful summer about 15 years ago as a visiting fellow at Pakistan's National Defense University, where there's a library full of these things. So I've been following it. And as I write, I had largely dismissed this writing because I thought it was bravado, or I thought it was fashionable, in the way that my students all want to write about artificial intelligence today. Or I thought it was a kind of a faint echo of the Chinese writing about informationized warfare, which you can see in the Science of Military Strategy and other key Chinese documents. But I did reassess that, and I actually looked back at some of the Chinese writing on this. Because the Chinese writing underscores this concept that information warfare can't be given just a single lane in a conflict. It can't just be one line of effort. But in modern warfare, information operations have to be embedded in every aspect of warfare because of the networked nature of warfare today and future crises. And I think in looking in particular at the Pakistani dynamics in this conflict, there were a few things that caught my attention and made me look back at some of that Chinese literature and the Pakistani journals. One was a sense of extraordinary message discipline by Pakistan. Pakistan straight up denied that it had targeted Indian military installations during the chaotic first and second nights where there were barrages going back and forth across the border. And even after India, in official channels, said, hey, Pakistan hit 15 bases of ours, and now we're retaliating, Pakistan said throughout multiple channels in multiple ways, nope, that didn't happen. Now, I think Pakistan did target Indian bases, maybe not very successfully. But the fact that they responded in this way sowed confusion at a key juncture in the crisis as it was escalating. And it made India's retaliation look, frankly, a little bit odd and quite disproportionate in ways that could be seen to benefit Pakistan's narrative building or its operational planning. So there were glimpses here of substantial planning that seemed perhaps to fuse military and political misdirection at key moments in the crisis. Now, we also saw less sophisticated information operations, including this absurd claim that India launched ballistic missiles at Sikh population centers in India and Punjab. This seems to me much more transparently to be an attempt to stir up communal sensitivities. This pattern deserves more research, but I think I worried that I might have overlooked signs that Pakistan is planning its storytelling in war with much more intentionality and military-grade planning than in the past. And if you combine this dynamic with some of the dynamics that we saw in India, which was a very chaotic media environment, along with, I think, a rather lethargic Indian official apparatus that was sometimes slow to respond to quick-moving events. You put these pieces together, and you could begin to worry that the combination of Pakistani intentionality and an irresponsible Indian media and a rather slow Indian official statements could raise the risk of miscalculation in a crisis that unfolds with the kind of speed that we saw this one unfold.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
Well, I mean, there's another element to this, Josh, that I was thinking about as you were speaking, which is, this whole question of Pakistan's nukes and the fear that, Western policymakers often have about loose nukes, right? And, the prevailing narrative that showed up on CNN and in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal and other places like that was the Pakistanis had allegedly signaled to somebody, the Americans and others, that, maybe because the Indian Air Force was striking so close to their nuclear command and control headquarters that, they couldn't necessarily guarantee the sanctity of that chain of command over nukes. There's been other hypotheses out there saying that, Pakistan had deliberately perhaps moved some of its nuclear assets in ways that would be very visible to American intelligence as a way of drawing them in, essentially, and forcing India's hand to kind of to step down. So I don't know if either of those are true, but certainly, both of those have been reported in the Western media. So it strikes me that the combination of what you're talking about and the possession of nuclear weapons and the ability that gives to force people to rush in is also a unique dimension of what Pakistan can do on the kind of information warfare side.
I think that's absolutely correct. And if we distinguish between things that Pakistan might do in a crisis to intentionally signal from things that might not be intentional measures to signal, but are nonetheless worrying to India or to the United States, then I think it clarifies this even further. Convening the National Command Authority, which is the apex body notionally chaired by the Prime Minister that has decision-making authority over the nuclear weapons, that is a signal that was probably meant as much for Washington as it was for New Delhi. There may have been some other movements of material or weapons or even personnel that we will learn about. And Pakistan has to know that many of those movements would be seen by the United States and by India. But there are also questions that aren't directly related to signaling, which is that the United States has, in fact, had rather high confidence in Pakistan's ability to manage its nuclear weapons enterprise and to protect that enterprise in a rather risky environment with many extremist groups. But even the best efforts to protect weapons cannot protect against accidental, conventional military strikes near nuclear weapons that could result in a fission event and some kind of detonation. That's a real worry on the part of Americans and others, that there are things that Pakistan would not be able to control in the event of an Indian strike that was either intentionally or accidentally near nuclear weapons.
Let me come to the kind of fourth and final lesson, which has to do with drones. You write that, from a military perspective, one of the most consequential developments was the widespread use of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs as they've called. The kind of widespread use of drones and other UAV technology in this crisis is perhaps not so surprising, given what we've seen in other war scenarios, namely Russia-Ukraine. But you do say that, this is pretty worrying for a couple of reasons. And I wonder if you could just unpack for us, how does the introduction of drones here complicate things from a kind of escalatory dynamic situation?
The first thing to recognize is that we are not talking about a conflict in which one or two or three drones were used. We're talking about claims of hundreds of drones. And we're talking about multiple types of drones, from little quadcopters to loitering munitions that hover over targets to larger UAVs. And we're talking about multiple types of drone missions, from surveillance to electronic warfare to probing enemy defenses to direct attacks. So we don't even know yet the entire scope of how these platforms were used. But as you say in this piece, I try to think about what this might mean. And there were a couple of things that did stand out to me. One is that many of these UAVs appear to have been used as attritable assets, meaning you send them to probe air defenses. You don't expect to get them back. These are one-way missions, and you're trying to find vulnerabilities on the other side and or prompt the other side to use costly munitions, to spend down their magazine of munitions. This is smart. This is what any smart military would do, having looked at the war in Ukraine. But you do introduce the risks that come from attacking a pretty large surface area of your enemy's air defenses. And I mentioned earlier how countries rather get nervous when their air defenses are targeted. When you deploy dozens or even hundreds of drones, you're not attacking one air defense node. You're attacking an entire surface, potentially, of air defense. And that could cause militaries to respond out of fear or respond more impulsively. Second, there's an interesting question about how to interpret how dangerous a drone really is. The good news here is that many drones appear to have been used in targeting efforts. And I'll use the academic term here. No one seems to have totally freaked out. So maybe we can all conclude, hey, this is good. Drones are just a low-risk way to hit the other guy. But the bad news is that there was quite a lot of confusion in the midst of this crisis about whether any given explosion in India and Pakistan was from a UAV, from a loitering munition, from a cruise missile, or even from a ballistic missile. Militaries have a good reason to be more scared of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles because those are fast, destructive, and some of them can be equipped to carry nuclear weapons. This then is not the kind of confusion you want to see emerging in the midst of a conflict. This is what scholars call a discrimination problem. You can't tell the difference between different types of incoming weapons, and you don't know what they're carrying. In addition, both of the militaries, India and Pakistan, casually and I think at times irresponsibly conflated drones and missiles in their official statements, which just added to the confusion as this was happening about what is being used to target. Now, it's not hard to imagine that in a future conflict, that one country sends a drone to strike an air defense radar or a series of air defense installations. And the other country responds not with a drone, but with a cruise missile. And then you're in an environment where you could see escalation to the ballistic missile level in new and troubling ways. So this doesn't happen automatically. And we should be encouraged that drones were not seen as highly escalatory. But the confusion that they introduced should worry us as we're thinking about how the next crisis might look different than this one.
Okay, so as we think about what that next crisis might look like, one of the things you say towards the end of the piece is that obviously both sides are going to work to move expeditiously to try and learn and incorporate lessons from this conflict for future procurements, right? Operational plans. I mean, they want to build stuff. They want to acquire stuff. They want to kind of adjust their doctrine. Let's start with Pakistan first. What do you think, from the perspective of the Pakistani military, the major takeaways from this conflict are?
I think that Pakistan probably feels pretty good about how the Pakistan Air Force performed in air-to-air combat. They probably feel pretty good about their deep defense industrial cooperation with China. And I expect that they will continue to deepen that industrial cooperation, but also the training programs that they have with the PLA Air Force, which, this is just speculation, have probably been quite consequential in helping the Pakistanis game out operational plans and even tactical approaches to conflict with India. At the same time, they have some things to be nervous about. They will probably wonder why their deeper air defense systems do not seem to be able to slow or meaningfully degrade the barrage of Indian attacks rather deep into their territory. And there may be questions about how well the Turkish drones that Pakistan had procured were able to operate in Indian airspace. We have seen in recent days quite a lot of evidence of Indian missiles or drones in Pakistani territory. We've seen evidence of Pakistani military facilities that were visibly damaged by Indian attacks. We have not seen very much of the converse. We have not seen very much good evidence that Pakistani drones or missiles were able to meaningfully degrade Indian military facilities.
And when you think about the other side, right, what do you think are the big takeaways from the Indian military's perspective?
India will probably come away encouraged about how their air defense system seems to have operated and the ways in which they were able to defend against incoming Pakistani munitions. India did lose some fighter aircraft. We don't know how many. There are wildly varied numbers out there in the press. And if you'll allow me just a brief digression here, I think it's possible that some of the Indian losses of their fighter aircraft were attributable in part to constraints put on the Indian Air Force in the form of conservative rules of engagement. So typically, if you were to tell the Indian Air Force to move close to the border to fire standoff missiles at terrorist camps within Pakistan, they would say, sure, but I'd like to take out the following Pakistani air defenses along the border first to make this a little bit more comfortable and a little bit safer. Now, I have no inside information here, but it would not surprise me if the Cabinet Committee on Security or some other civilian leader said, hey, your first strike has to be against a terrorist target, because that's the story that we're telling, right? That's our proportional retaliation against Pakistan for the terrorist attack. And so these decisions about rules of engagement could have put the first wave of Indian fighters at somewhat greater risk than they might otherwise have been because of the broader political objectives. This is something I think for us to look at and consider that sits in this operational lane of takeaways that will be reviewed.
I mean, just on that for a second, Josh, I asked Chris Clary last week on the show this very same question, because again, as somebody who's not a military security analyst myself, right, it seems like the obvious sequence is first you take out your opponent's air defense systems and then you strike your targets. And Chris's point is that is the logical sequence. But if you are trying to do what India said it was trying to do, which was to be targeted, to be narrow, to be non-escalatory, then this reverse sequence could make sense.
It does. And it could be an example of the preeminence of political and strategic objectives over operational value, in that instead of suppressing enemy air defenses, you acknowledge that it is important for India to make its first strike on Pakistan to be against terrorist targets, because doing otherwise would make it hard to tell a story of Indian restraint and proportionality that's important for whatever happens next.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't want to. I interrupted you in midstream.
No trouble. There are some other things that I think will be important for India to wrestle with in the aftermath of this crisis. One is that India probably needs a significantly deeper reserve of missiles and munitions for a long conflict. and also needs to be able to coordinate what could involve multiple fronts. And we could be talking about multiple fronts with Pakistan, including naval dimensions or others, or multiple fronts with China. Probably not a full-blown two-front conflict, but you have to think in such a conflict, even small mobilizations of Chinese forces or small alerts by Chinese forces could severely complicate Indian military efforts to allocate their forces in a crisis between the two theaters. You also have questions within the Indian system, I think, about the limits of integrating all of the different kinds of systems that India has. I've written about this, and I've called India's inventory a motley force. You have indigenous systems, American systems, Russian systems, Israeli systems, French systems. For the time being, these have seemed to operate pretty well together. But as India continues to build out its military with an eye toward future warfare, which is going to be all about networking your systems along with space assets in order to have a real-time picture of the battlefield. That's what future war is going to be like. It's going to get harder and harder to patch together all of these different kinds of platforms. And that then prompts questions. Do you add more Russian F-400 radars? If that means that you may not in the future be able to buy F-35 fighters or really advanced U.S. systems because the United States doesn't want its advanced airplanes being painted by Russian origin radars. Do you buy F-35 fighters because they're great, they're better than the Russian Su-57? Or do you avoid those American platforms because you look at this crisis and take away some lessons about perhaps some of the risks of giving the United States leverage in the form of having U.S. equipment? So there will, I expect, be some bigger picture reflections about what this means for Indian procurement. And then finally, India has a major effort underway to make much of its own military equipment. And it should. This is sensible. This is compelling, but its efforts are spread very, very thin. And so there's a way in which this crisis can and should prompt India to think a little bit more carefully about where it can make targeted investments based on what it learned in this crisis, based on what it learned about what it needs and what it can reasonably produce at high quality versus what it should buy from the outside.
Josh, I want to end by talking about something that we haven't explicitly discussed thus far, which is the role of the United States. Now, you have sat in the hot seat when you were at the National Security Council, so you know what these crisis-like scenarios feel like when you're on the inside. I guess I have two questions here, just drawing on that expertise, which is, was it inevitable that the U.S. would get involved in tamping down tensions? And how do you think the U.S. appears to both India and Pakistan, coming out of this conflict?
Those are great questions. I think the United States is really the only country that is well positioned to serve as a crisis broker between India and Pakistan. When I was at the White House, we would map out a crisis management playbook before an India-Pakistan crisis had even struck. What were our engagement strategies? How would we coordinate with key partners? Where might we have points of leverage? What intelligence should we try to collect in real time as a crisis is developing? I don't know if the Trump team made those same kind of detailed preparations, but they clearly experienced pressure to intervene as the crisis deepened. And as much as my Indian and Pakistani friends would like to think sometimes that there is no need for third-party intervention, I think the long history of India-Pakistan crises and the accelerating history says otherwise. As to how India and Pakistan might see the United States after its intervention, well, look, I was struck about the nature of the U.S. response, and I found it a bit atypical in three ways. First, it was just a bit slower. It was clear from the early days that Secretary Rubio was talking to his counterparts, but Vice President Vance publicly signaled that the United States was not too eager to get involved. And there just were not many public statements in the way that there had been in past crises. Second, it struck me that there wasn't as clear of a ladder of responses. Usually you see public statements that become more direct or express greater concern over time. Or you begin to hear that the State Department might consider increasing the travel warning for Americans in the region, which is a potentially very important signal to both countries, particularly to New Delhi. That didn't happen this time, even when things were blowing up in both countries in the midst of the crisis. And third, Secretary Rubio might have thought that he had to find some language about India and Pakistan agreeing to talks on a broad set of issues in order to get to a ceasefire deal. He may or may not have been right about that, but that language that he used, both structurally and historically, favors Pakistan. And the Indian government has all but publicly denied that that was ever agreed to. So I think that the Indians are clearly somewhat annoyed about that statement and about President Trump's bragging about his role in bringing about a ceasefire. But they're probably also counting on the fact that the president's attention may soon wander elsewhere, and that it is unlikely that the United States will follow through with any vigorous or serious efforts at convening both sides on a broad set of issues, or that the United States will apply meaningful pressure on India to have that wider conversation in the wake of this crisis.
So, Josh, just to ask one quick follow-up on this, then, based on what you've said, I intuit that you are not so pessimistic about the prospect of a re-hyphenization between India and Pakistan, and that the way in which the U.S. kind of reacted to this conflict is going to do much irreparable or long-term damage to the U.S.-India partnership, because the Indians will know that this is the president being the president, and at the working level, at the bureaucratic level, things will continue as they have been. Is that a fair assessment?
I would agree with that. I think this will probably not have a major impact on the U.S.-India relationship. But I think that India perhaps should worry less about the United States trying to rehyphenate India and Pakistan, and perhaps should worry a little bit more about how India's own response in this crisis might serve to rehyphenate India and Pakistan, both in the eyes of the world and with respect to the kinds of priorities and resources that are devoted within India to what they call the problem of Pakistan. India spent enormous time and effort over the last decade in thinking about the security challenges, the economic challenges, and the technology challenges posed by China. And there is some risk that by announcing that future terrorist attacks will be met with a strong response to Pakistan, that Indian leaders might have walked themselves back into a corner a little bit in a way that could distract from a longer arc of an effort to expand India's influence and prestige on the world stage, to meaningfully undertake policies that prevent China from coercing India on technology or in economic or security domains. and establishing India as a successful developmental state.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Joshua White. He's the author of a new essay, Lessons for the Next India-Pakistan War, published by Brookings. Josh is a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, as well as a non-resident fellow at Brookings. He's also the author of a forthcoming new book called Vigilante Islamists, Religious Parties and Anti-State Violence in Pakistan that will be published later this fall by Oxford University Press. Josh, I really meant it when I said that this essay really jumped out to me as something that was kind of a picture of analytical clarity, and I hope all of our listeners will read it. We will link to it in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the program today.
Always a pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.